Previously on solo leveling Ragnarok, dungeon breaks had begun erupting across the country, with one tearing open in the middle of Seoul and spilling monsters into the streets without pause. Chaos spiraled in broad daylight as hunters on site could only watch the carnage unfold, until Suho tore through the battlefield, revealing his face and identity to the world for the first time. But he was no longer the Suho the world once knew. Something in him had changed. He was no longer a silent shadow fighting alone in the dark. His power now expanded beyond even his understanding, leaving him unsure of its true limits. Not far from him, a D-rank hunter fought with newfound vigor, clad in the black armor granted by Suho's shadows. For the first time, the man felt his body lighten, empowered enough to stand his ground against monsters that had once paralyzed him with fear. Watching him, Suho felt a faint reassurance settle in. There would be no need for him to intervene here. So he turned his attention elsewhere, raised his hand, and uttered the word that slithered through the fallen corpses around him: "Arise." The shadows stirred instantly, twisting and coiling, before reshaping into soldiers clad in black mist, ready to serve their master. This was the gift of Suho's new power, shadow creation, a skill that felt like an extension of his will itself. Through it, he could channel the lingering essence of his shadow soldiers to reconstruct items, armor, or weapons. Each creation he equipped flooded him with overwhelming attack and defense power. Yet even in that surge, his thoughts turned inward as he noticed an inconsistency in the grades of the items he conjured. The armor he envisioned had manifested as rare, but the gauntlet he forced into existence appeared only as common. The disparity puzzled him until it became clear that the quality of his creations depended on the materials he used as a base, and that to unlock the true potential of this contract skill, he would need a shadow item of hero grade or higher. Just as Suho contemplated the meaning of his job title, a sudden tremor shattered his focus. The surviving Naga beast charged at him in a frenzy, but before he could react, a figure dropped from atop a nearby building and landed squarely on one of the beasts, crushing its skull with a single impact and halting Suho mid-step. As debris scattered around him, Suho peered forward and found Dojin standing calmly amid the monster herd, not a single bead of sweat on his brow. The newly awakened S-rank didn't waste a second. He activated his skill amplification and annihilated every remaining beast in a single blow, leaving behind only silence and the fading stench of mana. Suho and the surrounding hunters could only stare in astonishment. The power of an S-rank was on a different plane entirely, and as Suho and Dojin exchanged a brief glance, the difference between them became painfully clear. The realization was nothing short of nerve-wracking. Far from the battlefront, the live broadcast streamed everything directly to the Hunter Association. Jinho melted into raw relief the moment he saw Suho alive, and beside him, Jincho exhaled as his own tension finally eased. But before the calm could settle fully, a sharp tone cut through the room as Jincho's phone began to vibrate. It was a three-way call from Jung-in and Taegyu. Both men, with a mix of disbelief and urgency, recognized Suho immediately through the broadcast, pointing out that he was the masked figure they encountered the night they ran into Minsung. Taegyu immediately sprang into action and accused Suho of murdering Minsung, urging the association to prepare for restraint and extraction, convinced that force was necessary. Alarmed by the sudden rush to judgment, Jinchul pushed back, insisting they had no concrete evidence tying Suho to any criminal acts. But Taegyu only hardened his stance, reasoning that the mask and the connection were proof enough for the association to move. Jung-in, however, refused to brand Suho a criminal. He urged the others to act justly and carefully, suggesting a formal investigation before taking any drastic action. After a tense exchange, a decision was finally reached, and an order was relayed directly to Dojin, who stood face to face with Suho on the ground. As soon as the call ended, Dojin delivered the message with professional steadiness, informing Suho that he was being summoned to the association. Suho barely had time to process the situation before Dojin's tone shifted into accusation as he outlined the charges. He was wanted for the murder of Lee Min-sung and for involvement in the distribution of stardust. Suho's eyes widened in disbelief, unable to reconcile the words he was hearing, but Dojin remained composed and urged him to avoid escalation, stating that it would be best for Suho to accompany him without resistance. Choosing not to protest, Suho complied and took a step forward, at which point the black armor adorning the hunters dissolved into mist and streamed back into him. Dojin watched silently, unable to ignore the faint ripple of power radiating from Suho. Something about him felt fundamentally different, as if Suho had stepped into a tier beyond human advancement. It became clear to Dojin that Suho's transformation had diminished the star fragment's effectiveness, and that to succeed in their designs, the fragment itself would need to evolve. For now, however, he chose to remain at Suho's side, quietly observing and waiting for the right moment. As the two began walking together, a sharp buzz rippled through the air. Hunters paused as their phones vibrated simultaneously with a disaster alert from the association. Confusion spread as they read the notice aloud. There had been a massive breakout at the Jisan Correctional Facility, a high-security prison built specifically to contain the most dangerous awakened criminals. The site had descended into chaos, and buried among the warning text was a single word that cut through everything: Stardust users. The moment Suho saw it, he froze, tension coiling through his expression as the implications settled heavily on his mind. Seeing him halt abruptly, Dojin questioned his intentions, prompting Suho to respond with a grim resolve that he needed to act. They couldn't allow the escapees to roam freely, but Dojin countered calmly, unmoved, stating that the association had already dispatched hunters to the site, and there was no need for Suho to get involved. Suho, however, did not waver. His voice carried a quiet certainty as he reasoned that if the fugitives had consumed stardust, ordinary hunters would stand no chance against them. Dojin responded only with a firm reminder of the trouble Suho would invite by disobeying the association's orders. But Suho, having already made up his mind, accepted whatever consequences awaited him and activated his bond skill, assuring Dojin that he would report to the association as soon as the urgent matter at hand was resolved. With that, Suho blurred out of sight, vanishing in a heartbeat and leaving only the faint impression of where he had stood. Dojin watched him disappear with the briefest hint of a smile, silently promising himself that from now on he would keep Suho close in his sight, measuring exactly how far the newcomer had advanced. Far away, alarm screamed as the Jisan Correctional Facility plunged into chaos. Red warning lights swept across the skyline, while emergency broadcasts flooded radios and phones, but it was already too late. Flames licked across prison walls, and the scorching heat fractured concrete into jagged veins. Years of resentment and cruelty, smoldering in the hearts of the inmates, ignited into raw, unfiltered fury. Among them, the one who rallied the scattered awakened criminals, urging them to break the seals and unleash their pent-up rage, was none other than Hwang Dong-suk, utterly convinced that he was justified. Hundreds answered his call, and the facility roared with the fury of inmates flooding out of their cells. A full-scale prison breach had begun. News channels soon swarmed the airwaves with identical headlines about the large-scale breakout at Jisan, urgent evacuation orders for nearby civilians, and desperate pleas to follow the hunters' instructions echoed non-stop. But not everyone had time to heed the warnings. In a quiet residential block, the thin boundary between normal life and cataclysm shattered when a band of fugitives targeted an apartment. They tore the door off its hinges, turning a mundane home into the first casualty of the spreading disaster. They swept through the complex, swapping prison uniforms for civilian clothes, ready to strike their next victims. Their confidence burned as fiercely as the fires behind them, fueled by the star fragment given by Dong-suk, who had convinced them that the Hunter Association could be toppled if they seized the city and took hostages. The fugitives moved with no hesitation, turning the streets into an inferno. Prisoners poured out like spilled oil, leaving behind a trail of death and arson. Low-ranking hunters tried to stem the tide but were overwhelmed, outnumbered, and taken down by coordinated strikes. The riot spread with deliberate cruelty, transforming peaceful neighborhoods into battlegrounds. Watching it all from the edge of a building, Dong-suk stood above the chaos, savoring the spectacle like a man admiring the legend he believed he was creating. At that moment, a man approached him, urging him to move ahead and reminding him that their coup required action, not sightseeing. Dong-suk met the suggestion with scorn, telling the man to know his place and calling him nothing more than his brother's subordinate. But the newcomer's voice stayed steady as he clarified, with cold precision, that he was no one's pawn. He was B-rank hunter Kang Taishik, acting under commission to extract Dong-suk, a mere C-rank, and escort him overseas. Dong-suk's fury ignited instantly. He grabbed Taishik by the collar, accusing him of looking down on him and invoking the difference in rank while demanding respect. Rage flickered dangerously in Taishik's eyes, and for a moment he considered tearing Dong-suk apart. But then his mind flicked back to the orders given by S-rank Hwang Dong-su. Dong-suk was to be retrieved under the convenient smokescreen of the prison riot, and failure to comply would carry consequences severe enough to make Taishik regret being alive. Pulled back into the present, Taishik buried his contempt beneath a blank expression. He could not afford to turn an S-rank, especially one as volatile as Dong-su, into an enemy. So, he forced calmness into his voice, agreeing to guide Dong-suk to his brother as requested. Elsewhere, another rooftop trembled beneath the landing skids of a tactical chopper. Its rotors hammered the air as it touched down, and two figures stepped out. Chairman Jinchul was the first to emerge, followed by Jong-in, who noted that it had been the first time since the Great Cataclysm that they would fight together again. Jinchul acknowledged the sentiment quietly, stating he could not sit by and merely watch. Jong-in then asked about the scale of the disaster at Jisan, and Jinchul's answer was bleak. The administration center had been completely obliterated, and worse still, the association hunters who attempted to intervene had been ambushed by unknown forces. Jong-in's expression hardened. For a control center guarded by an A-rank to fall, especially with star fragments involved, the implications were unmistakable. Someone powerful was moving behind the scenes. Another voice joined them then. Lim Taegyu stepped forward with Dojin beside him, acknowledging the gravity of the situation and agreeing that someone was indeed pulling the strings. But before addressing the unknown mastermind, Taegyu brought up another issue, spitting out Suho's name and revealing that the hunter had refused the association's summon and instead had gone straight to Jisan. Connecting the dots, Taegyu reasoned that a man suspected of trafficking stardust had willingly rushed into a place overrun by stardust users. To him, that could mean only one thing. Suho was a high-risk villain and the prime suspect behind the current catastrophe, and eliminating him became Taegyu's top priority. Jinchul's shock broke through the accusation as he refused to accept conjecture as fact and demanded caution. Jong-in, however, framed the situation with blunt practicality, pointing out that Suho's behavior had defied explanation at every turn, and that, for the time being, the safest course was to treat him as hostile until proven otherwise. From his vantage point on the ground, Dojin watched the discussion with a calm, unreadable expression. The situation was far too volatile to engage recklessly, and with Suho absent, the opportunity before him was too valuable to ignore. For now, he resolved to maintain his distance and simply observe. Meanwhile, far from here, Suho raced across a ravaged landscape with a pace so fast it split the air, lightning-like trails marking his passage as he tore through the distance toward the Jisan facility. Vaulting high above the rooftops, he scanned the expanse below, and the sight that met him froze the breath in his chest. The city surrounding the prison had become a pit of suffering. Screams pierced the air like blades, each one carrying the raw weight of terror and despair. Suho's heightened senses, sharpened by the bond skill, turned the world into a chorus of agony that clawed at his mind. Sensing the urgency firsthand, he descended without pause, Gray materializing beside him as they landed in perfect synchronicity. Sliding to a halt, they took in the grim aftermath. Streets painted in blood, lifeless bodies sprawled across cracked pavement, and prisoners standing over the corpses. Seeing Suho and his companion land before them, the escapees sneered, mocking the pair, convinced Suho was too drained to fight. But before another word left their mouths, Suho blurred forward, cutting through the air and taking down one of the fugitives in an instant, sending him sprawling bloodied across the ground. He then addressed the rest with chilling composure, his tone sharp as he offered their ultimatum, telling them to surrender and be knocked out quietly, or resist and die where they stood. The cold warning made the mobs falter, their voices trembling in fear as they struggled to process what had just happened. Yet their panic twisted into reckless bravado, and clinging to false confidence, they pulled out jagged shards of star fragment and crushed them between their teeth. Within moments, a violent aura erupted around them as the corruption took hold, the mark of the star fragment burning in their eyes, while its intoxicating power made them believe they had transcended their limits and that no one could stop them. Their defiance hardened Suho's expression, cracking the composure he had forced upon himself. Irritation surged into fury, and without another thought, he brought his foot down on the nearest fallen prisoner's skull, crushing it in a brutal motion. Panic rippled through the others as they raised their weapons and charged, but Suho met them with lethal precision, intercepting the first attacker mid-swing, snatching his blade, and cutting through his flesh with the very same weapon. The prisoner collapsed lifeless before the others even understood what happened. One survivor stammered in disbelief, unable to comprehend how even after swallowing a star fragment and feeling power surge through his veins, he still couldn't see Suho's attack. That confusion became his last thought when Suho's fist shattered his jaw with a single blow, launching him into a nearby wall. Without stopping, two more inmates lunged at Suho from behind, weapons raised, only for him to not even look back. Shadows burst from beneath his feet, solidifying into jagged spears that erupted upward with a violent snap, slicing through the attackers mid-flight and scattering their blood through the air. Silence followed, heavy with the metallic scent of blood. And then, inside Suho's mind, Minsung appeared beside him within the vast space of his consciousness. His expression caught between mockery and fascination. He studied Suho with a knowing smirk, as if savoring the transformation. He remarked on how much Suho had changed, how swiftly he had grown stronger, and how natural the violence had begun to look on him. His tone darkened, twisting with cold amusement, as he whispered that perhaps Suho was no longer a human at all, and had become a monster himself. As Minsung's ghost faded, Suho silently called Beru and issued his command, telling him to consume the corpses and read their memories to find whoever was responsible for the prison breakout. The Ant King obeyed, though before digging in, he paused with a cautious tilt of his head, asking if it was truly all right to act without hiding his identity. Suho crouched beside a fallen hunter, closing the man's eyes before answering. He admitted he had come here only to save people, but saving them had sparked something larger. In a time where unity was needed most, when preparing for the looming threat of the Apostle of Itarim should be the priority, the awakened were still fighting among themselves. His patience for these localized conflicts had worn thin, and Suho believed that, at this rate, he would only end up holding his father back. That was why he had decided to stop hiding and resolved to step forward and unify everything himself. He planned to bring together every form of power in this world: monarch descendants, hunters, villains, artifacts, even magic beasts, to stand against the apostle. It was a commitment he intended to fulfill, no matter what method he had to use. But first, he needed to clean up the fugitives here, and then hunt down countless others hiding throughout the city. For that, he needed numbers. So, he lifted his right hand, power thrumming beneath his skin as the command gathered in his throat. And then, without hesitation, his voice slid out sharp and clean like a blade: "Arise." At the same moment, elsewhere in the city, a sleek luxury sedan cut through the road in silence until a sphere of roaring flame hurtled out of nowhere and struck the side of the car, detonating in a blinding flash. The explosion ripped the calm apart, sending shards of metal and glass scattering across the street. On the roof of a nearby building, the same criminals who had raided the apartment earlier watched the scene unfold like hunters on a perch. One leaned forward, grinning, as he sneered at the chaos below. But the scene didn't unfold the way they expected. Through the crackle of flames, a large hand gripped what was left of the driver's side door and tore it free with a single pull, hurling it upward toward the rooftop. The mangled steel slammed into the wall beneath their ledge, sending concrete dust erupting into the air and freezing the rioters in shock. Shortly after, two figures stepped from the wreckage, moving with effortless precision through the inferno. The first to emerge from the smoke was Miho of the White Tiger Guild, and beside her stood her father, Baek Yunho. Together, the father-daughter duo launched a coordinated assault, reducing pockets of resistance to nothing in mere minutes. With the attackers subdued, Baek asked about the Jisan facility, and Miho estimated the scale at a grim 500 escaped prisoners. Baek considered the severity of the situation, but the safety of civilians came first, and he ordered Miho to begin the rescue immediately. But before she could take a step, Baek's head snapped sharply to the side as he noticed something strange, his gaze locking onto nearby buildings where eerie, unfamiliar figures lingered in the shadows, as if the darkness itself had taken shape to watch them. Elsewhere across the city, another district had become the center of the escapees' atrocities as they continued killing hunters and civilians alike. A girl watched her lover die before her eyes and cried out in anguish while the prisoners sneered over his pale body. One of them barked at her to stop sobbing and closed in with his sword held high, ready to send her to join him. But before the blade could fall, the air shifted and shadows churned at the dead hunter's side. They coalesced into a dark figure that stepped between the sword and the girl. The prisoner recoiled in disbelief at the sight of the dead man's silhouette rising again, unable to comprehend it. Suho, standing afar as he watched the summon take form, offered the fallen hunter one last duty: to protect what had mattered to him in life. The shadow obeyed without hesitation and struck with judgmental force, crushing the attackers so decisively they didn't even draw breath before collapsing. As resistance crumbled, Suho moved through the vicinity and resurrected more shadows, sending them out to hunt down the scattered fugitives. Watching their numbers swell at an astonishing rate, Beru couldn't hide the pride swelling in him over Suho's shadow authority. Even Suho acknowledged how terrifyingly effective it was, remembering how he'd once dismissed it as useless. For a moment, he let that satisfaction settle, noting how differently he carried himself now compared to the first clashes of the night. But the calm shattered when his instincts suddenly flared. In an instant, he sensed many of his shadow soldiers falling to a concentrated strike. Beru snapped to attention as well, promising Suho with grim certainty that he would uncover the mastermind behind this. Far off, the one responsible, Taishik, was carving through Suho's summons with brutal efficiency. Across from him, Dong-suk watched the carnage with a mixture of awe and panic, barking orders and urging Taishik to finish up quickly. Annoyed, Taishik muttered that he was already on it, dismissing the shadows as mere C and D ranks. But then, his expression twisted in confusion as the summons abruptly dropped to their knees in perfect unison, as if bowing before a higher will. The reason became clear when Suho approached with a serious expression, fixing his gaze on the man at the center of the riot. He closed the distance and, with cold calmness, asked Dong-suk if he knew anything about the Apostle of Itarim. Startled, Dong-suk hastily lifted a hand to stop him, insisting he knew a thing or two about the Apostle. It was a bluff, and while he talked, Dong-suk signaled Taishik to attack Suho, certain that a summoner type would have low stats. On cue, Taishik blurred forward with blinding speed, his blade flashing toward Suho. But just before the steel could connect, his eyes widened. The blade passed through empty air. Suho had vanished, reappearing an instant later, directly in front of Dong-suk. Irritation flickered across his face as he placed a steady hand on Dong-suk's shoulder and demanded the truth. How the fugitives had obtained star fragments and why they had turned a prison break into a massacre if he had no connection to the Apostle. Crushed beneath Suho's overwhelming presence, Dong-suk tried to force arrogance into his voice by threatening him with the name of his S-rank brother. But the attempt shattered when Suho pressed down with brutal strength, steel-like claws sinking into his shoulder and forcing him to his knees as cracks splintered through the stone beneath him. His scream tore through the air, blood pooling around Suho's grip, and under the pain, he finally admitted everything, that the fragments had come from his brother and the killings were nothing more than twisted entertainment. Suho's blood boiled at the confession. Taishik watched with growing alarm, realizing the situation had spiraled out of control. Deciding to abandon Dong-suk, he prepared to run, but before he could move, a voice echoed in his mind like a command and compelled him to follow the impulse. Dojin, operating far from the melee, had seized control of Taishik's body to measure Suho's abilities firsthand. Under this foreign compulsion, Taishik lunged towards Suho with terrifying swiftness, using his stealth skill. Suho's senses flared at the last possible moment, and he pivoted aside, but Taishik's redirected strike continued without mercy. The blow tore through the figure standing nearest to Suho. Dong-suk's body twisted as invisible slashes ripped across him, blood bursting from wounds that appeared out of thin air. His eyes widened in shock before the light drained from them completely, and he collapsed with a heavy thud. Blood spread quickly across the street, soaking into the dirt, yet Suho remained unmoving, his sharp eyes following the unnatural disturbance with cold clarity. At his side, Beru suddenly stiffened, his voice ringing with certainty as he sensed the unmistakable presence of the Apostle nearby, and Suho's expression sharpened in response. His resolve hardened, knowing that at last he would meet his enemy face to face. First, he had to deal with the uncontrollable freak of nature that was Taishik, who cut through the shadow summons with practiced cruelty and in the same motion slipped past Suho, leaving a thin, stinging line across his cheek. Suho, however, remained unfazed, showing no hint of shock despite Taishik's immense speed and assassin camouflage that made his hits almost invisible. He stayed calm, still able to catch faint echoes of Taishik's footsteps thanks to his sharpened senses. Yet all he could do for now was dodge. There was simply no opening for a counterattack. From his vantage point, Dojin watched keenly, confidence swelling as the fight unfolded. To him, it looked completely one-sided. With Taishik's power now touching the threshold of an upper A rank, he deemed it impossible for Suho to overcome him. Just then, a voice slid sharply into his mind. Suho's voice echoed inside Dojin's skull, cutting through distance and tearing open the logic that had kept him hidden in the shadows all this time. Suho admitted that he had hidden his existence because the idea of others discovering him carried too much risk. It had been a calculated move. But after witnessing the so-called invader from outer space hide in the same fashion and manipulate others through stardust rather than acting directly until the Minsung incident, the meaning became clear. Realizing this parallel, Suho inferred that just like him, the apostle was a being preparing and still evolving, and hearing that deduction left Dojin speechless. He hadn't expected Suho to piece the truth together so quickly. On the ground, Suho continued, and the shadows answered him like a living tide, surging outward as he raised his hand. His voice, low and resolute, cut cleanly through the night as he declared his resolve to stop hiding and demanded that the apostle reveal itself as well. At that command, the shadows burst forth toward the unseen enemy. Taishik snapped into position, ready to counter, yet the flicker of panic in his eyes betrayed him. He realized far too late that Suho had already tracked him. Out of the darkness, Suho appeared directly before him, a shadow lance clenched tightly in his grip. The weapon erupted outward in a dozen lethal angles, piercing Taishik mercilessly and hemming him in until his assassin camouflage shattered under the relentless assault. With a final strike, his body crumpled, lifeless within seconds, and almost immediately, the system's clear chime cut through the settling haze, confirming Suho's level up. But his attention had already shifted. He cast one cold glance at Taishik's fallen form before speaking, not to the corpse, but to the presence behind it, calling the apostle to come out and face him at last. Inside the chopper, Dojin flinched the moment that voice hit him, pain lancing through his skull as blood trickled from his left eye. Taegyu, sitting beside him, whipped around and asked if he was all right, and Dojin forced himself to nod, covering the blood with a steady hand as he insisted everything was fine. Yet even as the pain throbbed beneath his palm, Suho's name echoed through the apostle's mind, and with a sinister curl of amusement, the entity acknowledged the challenger. For the first time, things were beginning to get interesting. That's it for the first episode of Solo Leveling Ragnarok Season 2. Stay tuned. More episodes are on the way. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss episode 2 when it drops. I'll see you soon with a brand new chapter.